Hey, hi everyone. This third part of this lecture is going to be on endurance programming. And there's four styles that I'm going to focus on: MLSS, alternating, stepwise, and mixed pace. And then after that, we'll have a few other protocols that you commonly see in the field. So let's go over the kind of just traditional way of creating an endurance program. And this is kind of true of many different types of programs too, right? Whether it be for training for a marathon or training for a triathlon or any kind of endurance-based programming. So what you see on the x-axis is weeks, and that goes from week 1 all the way to week 23. And on the y-axis, what you have is kilometers per week, which is basically mileage. And you can see that for every week, right, you see an increase of mileage. And then after about 4 weeks, you get a deload week, and then you go right back up. But then that second set is even more mileage, right? And then again, you get a break, and then continue that process, okay? And notice that there's a peak, and hopefully you're timing it so that peak is when the event is. This is not uncommon to other types of training, including resistance training, where, you know, every 3 to 5 weeks you have a deload week, okay? So this, again, is a very common type of training, especially in endurance-based programming. So let's go ahead and start with the maximal lactate steady state program. This is also known as MLSS. And essentially what you have here is that we know that we want to get our clients to the highest blood lactate concentration and workload without them accumulating blood lactate. So MLSSC is what denotes blood lactate concentration, and then MLSS is what denotes the actual workload. So obviously we aren't going to be, you know, taking someone's, you know, blood in their finger and measuring their blood lactate in the kind of field, right? You might do this in exercise physiology, you might do this in a research setting, but you typically don't do this with your average client, okay? For many reasons, okay? So what do you want to do with this in regards to actually programming? Well, all you want to do is get your client to basically the highest workload and effort that they can sustain over a period of time. And so for many of your clients, you know, if they're training, for instance, for a marathon, they might have a race pace or race pace plus day, where that day, whatever that distance is, they're kind of going the fastest that they can to make in the highest workload that they can have over that distance that you're prescribing. Okay, so that's what MLSS is. Very common in endurance-based programming to include some sort of MLSS programming. The second is alternating aerobic modes. So essentially all this is saying that we want to have our clients alternate the types of endurance exercise in one bout of exercise with us. So if we have them training for 30 minutes, we might have them do 10 minutes on the bike, 10 minutes on the elliptical, and then 10 minutes on the Stairmaster. And it's a pretty simple way of programming. It doesn't have to be 10 minutes, right? It could be 15, it could be 12, it could be whatever you denote. And you don't have to always keep the intensity the same as well, right? So you can look at this example, right? You might start them off at 60%, and then when they move to a next modality, it goes up to 70%. But the key behind this type of training is that you're simply alternating the type of aerobic exercise, okay? So it can't just be one type the whole time, you're alternating between different modes. The third one I want to show you is stepwise endurance training. And this is a fun one for people to do because it kind of gives them something to think about as they're programming. Whereas steady state involves doing the same thing for a period of time and kind of can get boring. This changes all the time. All right, so it's either forward or reverse stepwise programming. You can kind of see that in the diagram I have here. So essentially what it says is that you spend a period of time at a given intensity, and then you spend that same period of time at a step up or a step below that intensity. So in this example, we have 10 minutes at 50%, 10 minutes at 60%, 10 minutes at 70%, and then you decrease from there. Okay, I sometimes call this a pyramid type of programming, but it's technically known as stepwise endurance. Okay, again, very common. You don't have to do it for 10 minutes. It could be 15, it could be 5. You don't have to do 10% differences in your intensity. So it doesn't have to be 50, 60, 70. It can be 50, 55, 70. So those are things that you can kind of play around with your clients. But again, it's a fun way of training them so that they don't really get bored when they're doing their training. The fourth one is mixed paced endurance exercise. And this is very similar to undulated training. So if you're familiar with undulated periodization, it's very similar. Essentially, there's really no pattern, there's no rhyme or reason, and there's benefits to that, right? So if you have 10 to 15 blocks of changes in your exercise protocol, it's going to add variety for them, it's going to be fun, but you're also going to kind of constantly be, I hate saying this, but shocking the body so that the body doesn't get used to what it's doing. So essentially what you're trying to avoid is steady state. And steady state is when your heart rate kind of levels off because it gets used to that workload. So you're avoiding steady state so that your heart rate's kind of constantly alternating, either going up and then or going back down. Okay, so an example here is a 45-minute endurance workout. You start off with someone at 10 minutes for 50% of their heart rate max, then they do 5 minutes at 70%, and then they go 15 minutes at 60, and then 10 at 75. Again, there's no clear pattern here, and that's why it's known as kind of like following that undulated principle. Okay, so that is mixed-paced endurance exercise. So now let's talk about some of the cardiovascular programming styles that you probably already know about and see and potentially do yourself. So high-intensity interval training, HIIT training, has a lot of benefits, and the more literature that comes out, the more we know about it, okay? The obvious benefit of HIIT training is that you get a high caloric expenditure in a very small amount of time. So for many people, that's the best option that they can have, okay, and that they can do. The other benefit from HIIT training is that we're starting to see that it has many cardiovascular protective effects, right? So a lot of what was kind of talked about in the beginning of HIIT training was, well, does HIIT training have the same physiological effects as endurance-based, long-term endurance training? And the answer is more and more data is showing that. In fact, some HIIT training can have some other better physiological markers, right? You can have a greater EPOC. Some of the diabetic markers are improved after HIIT training compared to just regular endurance-based training. So there's certainly a lot of literature that still needs to be done and research that still needs to be done on this topic, but what we do know is that it's very promising. So here are some examples. You have sprint intervals or SIT, and those are very basic, right? You do 30 seconds max, right? And then you get a 4-minute recovery. And truthfully, when you use the word sprint, you need to be very careful because physiologically, we can't really sprint more than 30 seconds. So for instance, if you take a cycle class and someone says, okay, we're going to sprint for a minute, what you're thinking is you're like, actually, we're not sprinting, we're doing an interval, right? Like that's not a true sprint, that's more of an aerobic interval. Okay, aerobic intervals tend to be a little bit longer. So for in this example, AIT, it's 4-minute bout at about 80 to 90% of their max effort, and then you still get that 3 to 4 minute recovery. So the difference between that sprint interval and this aerobic interval is that the amount of time that you're working is different. Sprint, you're working hard for 30 seconds, and aerobic, you're working hard for 4 minutes. So obviously that 30-second bout is all out, right? It's 95+% of your max effort. Whereas the aerobic interval is a little bit lower, anywhere between 80 to 95, because you're sustaining it for a longer period of time. Okay, and again, we know that HIIT is effective at increasing VO2 max as well as decreasing some of those cardiovascular factors. Here are some other interval programs that you might have seen, and these are pretty traditional. So you kind of have an equal work to rest ratio, so 1 to 1, or sometimes you'll have the 1.5 to 1, which means you're on and working hard for 1.5, and then you're off for a minute. So that'd be, you do 90 seconds of all-out effort and then 1 minute to just rest, okay? So that 1 to 1 or 1.5 to 1 is a pretty common ratio for that. And then a lot of people are starting to incorporate circuit training, so resistance-based circuit training as part of their cardiovascular programming, because we know that we can include some more cardiovascular type movement patterns that are still technically resistance training in there. So you kind of kill two birds with one stone. So for instance, if you're doing a circuit training, you can have kettlebell swings, and you could do burpees, and you could do squat jumps, and you could do some plyometric movements. While those are definitely endurance-based, they still are strength-based as well. So that's a very common option for clients who are trying to do a lot in a little period of time. And I also want to mention this fun training known as FARTLEK training. And FARTLEK training I was first introduced to when I was in high school. Some of you who are runners probably know what this term is. It's a kind of a funny term. But essentially all it is that you vary your effort from, and this is traditionally in running, so you vary your running from a jog to a sprint, to a jog to a sprint, and it's at your discretion. There's no true, it has to be for this period of time or this % of your effort. And basically all it is you do continuous work plus some intervals in between. Okay, and they need to be true sprints. For many distance runners, this is a nice break in their traditional kind of long endurance runs. It adds variety and is very engaging, and it's a nice supplement for long distance runners. This is a nice program just to kind of show you how you can progress an endurance program with your client. So if you see over the next 3 slides, this is kind of the same Excel document, just put over 3 slides. What you see is week by week the changes that happen in exercise frequency, intensity, and duration. So you can see that the first thing that changes is always going to be duration, right? So in week 2, you go from 15 to 20 minutes to 20 to 25 minutes. Exercise intensity doesn't increase, right, until week 3. And then if you look at exercise frequency, that always stays between 3 to 4 for those first few weeks. Even when you get into the later part, it still stays 3 to 5. I think that's realistic because many of our clients don't have more than 3 days that they can give to their programming. And so how we can alter their training is by altering the intensity and duration rather than the frequency of their aerobic training. So that's a great place to pause and go ahead and start your next video, part 4, on metabolic equations.